In the heart of the isolated town of Pinebrook, nestled between mountains and dense woodlands, there was a patch of forest known only as Dark Hollow. It had earned its name from the way the trees cast shadows even in the brightest sunlight. Over the decades, it became infamous, shrouded in chilling rumors of disappearances and paranormal occurrences. Though many townsfolk dismissed the stories as mere legends, a nagging fear persisted, especially among the older generation who had lived through the strange incidents. Megan Doyle had only been in Pinebrook for a few months, sent by her editor to cover rural stories that might interest her urban readership. To her, the town seemed like any other sleepy village: quiet streets, a few diners, and a community that minded its own business. However, it didn't take long for her to hear about Dark Hollow. Almost every conversation with the locals veered into warnings about the woods. At first, Megan rolled her eyes at what she thought were the exaggerated fears of a superstitious town. Yet, the more she investigated, the more unsettling the stories became. The local library held newspaper clippings from the past 50 years detailing unexplained disappearances. Hikers, campers, even a few local children had vanished without a trace. There was no pattern to the disappearances, except for one commonality. All were last seen near or in Dark Hollow. Search parties found nothing. No tracks, no belongings, just eerie silence. The most recent case was from 2 years ago, a young man named Simon Keller who had been camping near the forest's edge. His tent was discovered fully intact, campfire still smoldering, but there was no sign of Simon. His disappearance shook the town, but like all others before him, he faded from memory over time. Megan, however, was fascinated by the mystery. As a journalist, she prided herself on her investigative skills, and she sensed there was more to this story than mere legend. But she wasn't just chasing a headline. There was something about Dark Hollow that intrigued her on a deeper level. Could it be that all these disappearances were connected, or was there something more sinister lurking within the woods? Despite multiple warnings from the town's elders, Megan decided she needed to experience the forest for herself. Armed with her camera, a flashlight, and a small notebook, she set off one autumn afternoon, determined to uncover the truth. The entrance to Dark Hollow was unremarkable. From a distance, it looked like any other stretch of forest, dense with tall, ancient trees and thick underbrush. But as she crossed into the tree line, Megan felt a noticeable shift in the air. The temperature dropped, and a cold wind stirred, rustling the leaves overhead. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional chirp of a distant bird. She walked deeper, her boots crunching against the fallen foliage, the forest floor damp and soft beneath her feet.
The deeper she ventured, the more disorienting the woods became. The trees grew closer together, their gnarled branches intertwining above her head, casting strange, elongated shadows. She tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. As a seasoned reporter, Megan wasn't easily spooked, but something about Dark Hollow was off. It felt alive, watching her. After an hour of walking, Megan stopped to take a break. She pulled out her camera to document the eerie surroundings. The first few shots were of twisted tree trunks and thick underbrush, but as she reviewed the images, a cold shiver ran down her spine. In one of the photos, just beyond the frame of a tree, there was a faint, blurry figure. She zoomed in, but the more she enhanced the image, the less clear it became. It wasn't a person. It was too distorted, too elongated to be human. She tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light or a flaw in the camera, but the unease was growing stronger. Determined to find some rational explanation, she pressed on, heading deeper into the woods. The trees began to close in around her, their branches forming tight, unnatural arcs overhead. The once clear path was now barely visible, swallowed by moss and fallen branches. As night began to fall, the forest transformed. The daylight was slowly suffocated by the dense canopy, and the temperature dropped even further. Megan had planned to leave before dark, but her curiosity had gotten the better of her. She checked her phone, only to find that it had no signal. It wasn't unusual given the remoteness of the location, but still, it left her feeling vulnerable. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The steps were deliberate, slow, as if someone or something was following her. She quickly spun around, her flashlight sweeping the darkness, but there was nothing there. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. No response. The woods were silent again, save for the sound of her own rapid breathing. Megan tried to convince herself it was just an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon. She forced herself to keep walking, but the footsteps resumed, this time closer. The sound of twigs snapping underfoot sent a chill down her spine. Panic set in, and she quickened her pace, her eyes darting around for any sign of movement. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, a tall, thin figure standing between two trees, its pale skin almost glowing in the dim light. It was motionless, watching her. Her heart raced, and without thinking, she turned and ran. She ran as fast as she could, branches whipping against her arms and legs as she tore through the underbrush. The footsteps behind her grew louder, quicker, closing the distance. Megan's chest burned as she ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stumbled, falling hard onto the forest floor, her flashlight skittering out of reach. The footsteps stopped, but the presence was still there, watching, waiting. Desperate, she scrambled to her feet and grabbed the flashlight, shining it in every direction. The figure was gone. She stood there, trembling, trying to steady her breathing. She needed to get out of the woods, now. But as she turned to retrace her steps, she realized she was completely lost. The path was gone, swallowed by the dense forest. Her heart sank as she spun in circles, trying to find any familiar landmark, but the trees all looked the same, towering over her like sentinels. Then in the distance, she saw a faint light, a flickering glow through the trees. Hope surged through her chest. Maybe it was a house or a campsite, someone who could help her. She hurried toward it, weaving between the trees, her flashlight beam bouncing erratically. But as she drew closer, she realized the light wasn't coming from a fire or a lantern. It was coming from the ground. She stopped short, staring down at the source. It was an old, weathered lantern, its flame barely flickering. Next to it, half buried in the dirt, was a tattered, mud-stained journal. With trembling hands, Megan picked up the journal and flipped it open. The pages were worn and faded, but the handwriting was clear enough to read. The entries detailed a man's descent into madness, his time spent in the woods, the things he had seen. He wrote of the whispers in the trees, the shadows that moved on their own, and the figure that followed him, always watching, always just out of sight. The final entry sent a chill down her spine. "I hear it now. It's close. I don't think I'll make it out." Megan's hands shook as she closed the journal and looked around. The forest was silent again, but she knew she wasn't alone. The figure was still out there, waiting for her to make a move. With a surge of adrenaline, she sprinted in the direction she thought would lead her back to town, her legs burning as she pushed herself harder than she ever had before. The whispers returned, growing louder, closer, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Just when she thought her lungs would give out, she broke through the tree line and stumbled into the clearing where she had first entered. She collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air, her body shaking with exhaustion and fear. Behind her, the woods stood silent and still, as if nothing had ever happened.